Good afternoon and welcome to the Refugee Advocacy Lab's final quarterly Executive Best Practices Series webinar for the year on building sponsorship infrastructure in states, creating the conditions for success. Thank you to everyone who is able to join us today. My name is Balqees Mihirig. I'm a Senior Policy Counsel at the International Refugee Assistance Project and also the Policy Advisor to the Refugee Advocacy Lab. For those who aren't familiar, the Refugee Advocacy Lab is an initiative co-founded by Refugees International, IRAP, the International Rescue Committee, or IRC, and Refugee Congress. The lab works to grow the movement for U.S. leadership on welcoming refugees by developing strategic communications resources, championing inclusive policies, and building capacity for the field. One of the ways we build capacity is by creating resources, thought leadership products, and spaces for peer learning for partners in the field. This series of best practices webinars was started 2 years ago when we first began to welcome Afghan evacuees. It is intended to provide an opportunity for executive state government staff to learn from experts and peers on different ways that states are responding to changes in who is coming to their communities, as well as hear best practices on policies and initiatives to improve the outcomes for refugees and other newcomers in their states. With the increase of people coming to the United States through non-traditional resettlement pathways, today we're excited to preview our latest report with you all on building sponsorship infrastructure in states. For today's panel, we will begin with a brief presentation of our report findings and recommendations, followed by a panel discussion moderated by my colleague at welcome.us, Kit Tainter, who will introduce our two guest panelists today. My presentation and the panel discussion will be recorded and shared with you all, along with the report early next week. The Q&A following the panel will not be recorded or shared so we can have an open conversation among peers. With that, we'll start sharing the PowerPoint presentation. Megan, if you can please share your screen. Next slide, please. Many of you know, in January of this year, the Biden administration announced the Welcome Corps program, also known as private sponsorship, which allows U.S. citizens and permanent residents to sponsor refugees currently in the U.S. refugee admissions pipeline. Sponsors are responsible for providing logistical, social, and financial support to refugees in their first few months here in the United States. Later this year, the second phase of the program is expected to launch, allowing sponsors to name a specific eligible refugee to sponsor. In addition to Welcome Corps, there are also other sponsorship programs that allow people from Ukraine, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela to come to the U.S. through temporary humanitarian parole if they have a financial sponsor. The screen illustrates some of the features of each sponsorship program, but I'll note that only Welcome Corps leads to a path to citizenship, while the others are temporary. In addition, most parole populations, with the exception of certain Ukrainians and Afghans, are not eligible for federal ORR benefits, such as refugee cash assistance, healthcare, and other services, with some very limited exceptions. This is a huge challenge for states who must respond to the needs of these new arrivals. Next slide, please. Sponsorship programs can have many benefits for refugees, for the refugees being sponsored, as well as the sponsors and the communities that welcome them. It brings communities together, it fosters welcoming attitudes, and a stat that I always like to cite in a recent poll of likely voters that the lab and Data for Progress did found that the statistic for those supporting the U.S. refugee resettlement program went up to 87% if they personally knew a refugee, and that goes across party lines. So that's a very significant statistic and something that sponsorship could help with. Sponsorship also accelerates refugee social and economic integration. At the same time, sponsorship can present some unique challenges, and some of you in the room are familiar. but specifically refugees refugees that are resettled by resettlement agencies go into communities with existing resettlement infrastructure and services. In other words, they're able to access refugee cash assistance, refugee medical assistance, receive health screenings, and also partake in long-term integration services such as English language training and employment programs, to name a few. On the other hand, sponsored newcomers will generally go into their sponsors' communities regardless of whether there's any resettlement infrastructure. That means there may be no resettlement agency or other service provider to administer refugee benefits. There might not be medical clinics that can carry out health screenings and limited long-term integration services. While sponsors in the Welcome Corps program must prepare a welcome plan and explain how they plan to address some of these challenges, the reality is that sponsors can't administer ORR benefits or establish integration programs. These are things that states and replacement designees must think about creatively about making these programs available and accessible throughout their states. Recognizing this gap, several states have already responded by implementing various initiatives, and some of this has already started with the U4U program and with Afghan arrivals and has carried over into Welcome Corps. But these various initiatives are meant to assist newcomers navigate and orient themselves to their new homes. There's really a critical role for states and replacement designees to fill when it comes to ensuring sponsored newcomers are aware of and have access to services for which they're eligible. Next slide. I think we skipped, sorry, I think we skipped a slide. Yes, new report, sorry. In late spring of this year, the Refugee Advocacy Lab, IRAP, Welcome.us, and CSH came together to create a resource that captures and elevates various state best practices in support of Welcome Corps and other sponsorship programs. The goal of this report was to outline the ways in which states and local government partners can create the conditions for successful private sponsorship. This resource will help state and local actors share existing and planned best practices, explore ways that newcomers arriving through sponsorship can connect with services regardless of where they reside, and consider new state and local policies and practices that support successful sponsorship. Next slide. To that end, in early July, we sent out a survey through the state coordinators of Refugee Resettlement Network, or SCORE, and we're very grateful to them for assisting us with this. And the survey was sent to state refugee coordinators across the country, asking them about the initiatives that they've put in place, as well as the best practices to support sponsored newcomers, the challenges that they were facing, and finally, what support they needed from ORR and other federal government agencies, as well as national, state, and local partners, including the Welcome Corps Consortium. We received responses from 23 states, and you can see them listed on the slide. And we followed up with in-depth interviews with 7 of those states. Next slide. In the report, we summarize, some of the initiatives that the states have started or plan to start. The top 4 initiatives that we've seen that states have either already launched or plan to launch. The first one is, and this one is also being facilitated by the Refugee Welcome Collective, is creating web pages or sections of web page or informational resources for private sponsors. And 100% of respondents said that they're undertaking this or have already launched that. Providing technical assistance to public benefit eligibility workers. 95% of respondents said that they were providing training or reaching out to their public benefits workers across the state to provide them information so that they're aware of sponsored newcomers. A few states have even hired specific staff to process these applications. And so this was a very, one of the top initiatives that states have done. The third one is hiring a sponsorship coordinator or community navigator to help coordinate sponsorship services. Some states have a designated position or multiple positions that do this. Some have assigned parts of certain staff's portfolios. But again, 82% of respondents said that this was something that they were doing or were planning to do. And finally, 55% of respondents said that they were developing state plans to mobilize the public to become sponsors, and they're actively planning on recruitment efforts, particularly in phase 2 of the program. Next slide. And this is a list of some other initiatives. They weren't as popular, but some states have started the process for contracting with an NGO to lead state sponsorship efforts. And this doesn't just include coordinating and providing information, it actually includes providing those services to sponsored newcomers. There's also direct technical assistance to private sponsor groups directly from states, as well as workforce partnership, and funding and resourcing for sponsorship, as well as, you know, a few initiatives on medical and mental health screenings. In the report, there's specific detailed examples of each of these, so I encourage you after this webinar, when you receive it, to take a look. Next slide, please. Some of you are probably familiar with some of the challenges that that SRCs are facing in states when it comes to sponsored newcomers. I won't go into a whole lot of details, but I have a couple on the screen. One of the biggest ones that we kept hearing over and over again was the unavailability of ORR funding for all populations. And this was truly a challenge, especially for states receiving CH&V applicants, of which not all are eligible. And several states are struggling with larger numbers of asylum seekers. So that was a common one. Having services in non-traditional resettlement areas was a big one. More information and data sharing of who sponsored individuals are and where they're going and their destinations was a common one that we heard. Inflexible state procurement processes was a big one. You know, SRCs weren't able to hire staff quickly enough or execute contracts. So that was a key challenge. Next slide, please. At the end of the report, we summarize some of the recommendations based on the feedback from state refugee coordinators. And despite all these challenges, as can be seen from the many initiatives that are underway, SRCs were examining their existing infrastructure and capacitating it to respond to the unique needs of sponsored populations, particularly those coming through Welcome Corps, which is intended to be a permanent program. But they still, you know, there's still areas for support. And so these recommendations, we've divided them up into 3. And the first set is directed to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. This is just a summary of our recommendations. More fulsome recommendations can be found in our report. So I encourage you to take a look at those. But the top recommendation, I think we went one, yeah. The top recommendation is clarifying that SRCs can request funding to build out infrastructure to support private sponsorship, such as hiring staff, that they can modify their state plans and resubmit their budgets at any time. When we spoke to SRCs, not everyone was clear on whether ORR funding could be used for that. And so we recommended to ORR, and they've received these recommendations that they should remind SRCs that this is available, and they can request to hire staff to respond and build that infrastructure that's needed. And then, of course, you know, assisting SRCs in troubleshooting recurring challenges and facilitating the creation of resources using things like Switchboard, and providing technical support on best practices, especially given the launch of the program is, you know, the expected launch of phase 2, which is a lot more people have signed up for that. encouraging national and local resettlement agencies to include privately sponsored refugees in services that OR has funded. This is a challenge because, due to capacity, a lot of resettlement agencies will serve only their own clients that come through RMP, but they're actually funded to provide services for everyone. And so reminding RAs that they need to find ways to have capacity to do that. And of course, improving coordination with other federal counterparts to ensure that guidance from ORR is consistent with other federal guidelines. And of course, sharing data from the different sponsorship programs was critical, um, uh, not just from Welcome Corps, but also from USCIS programs. Next slide. For states, the recommendation that really percolated to the top was improving and adding flexibility to state hiring and procurement processes. This is more challenging in some states where legislation is actually required than others. And so we just wanted to put that out there to legislators and those who work in state government to look at ways and, particularly ways that refugee-led service providers have an opportunity to be some of the individuals that are, or the businesses that are contracted. There are a lot of barriers that prevent refugee-led organizations from serving refugees, even though they have that lived experience. Establish and strengthen and expand a network for free or low-cost integration programming, such as English language training and employment. This will obviously require a state investment of funding, but this is really important for those sponsored newcomers who don't have federal funding. And so state funding would really assist with that. Next slide, please. And finally, we have a couple of recommendations for the Welcome Corps Consortium and resettlement agencies, to work with federal and state and local governments and partners to offer creative solutions to recurring challenges, including technical assistance, messaging guidance on how to effectively mobilize people to become sponsors was a big one that we heard frequently. And of course, advocating for additional and flexible ORR funding, thinking about ways that services in non-traditional resettlement areas or remote geographies can be implemented. This is a common problem. And, even in our survey and in our discussions with states, there's still questions around how to provide or if they can provide virtual services. Some states are still exploring that, but that's an area of for further exploration. And of course, considering a notification process that provides more than adequate advance notice for the arrival of sponsored newcomers. The earlier the SRCs know when refugees are arriving, the better, and the more that they could, look at what services are available in those geographies and respond accordingly. Next slide. So we hope you find this report helpful as you consider your state infrastructure. When states make these investments to expand services to sponsor newcomers, particularly in non-resettlement locations, they not only contribute to better integration outcomes, but also set the groundwork for a more inclusive and diverse and welcoming state. Although immigration is the federal government's purview, it's really state and local leaders who determine how well as a nation we integrate our newcomers and support their ability to thrive. So that's a quick summary of our report. And with that, I will hand it off to Kit Tainter, and we'll have an opportunity at the end for a more for questions and fulsome discussion. Thank you. Kit, hand it off to you.
Thanks, Balqees, and happy Thursday, everyone. I'm excited to introduce to you two great leaders in this work from the great states of North Dakota and Michigan. So first up, I want to introduce Holly Triska. She is a state refugee coordinator in North Dakota. She's a returned Peace Corps volunteer who spent 4 years in Central America and has led programs at the Federal Division at the Hispanic College Fund. She's a master's degree in international economic development and sees her work as an opportunity to transfer the sense of welcoming that she's received when she lived abroad in her home state of North Dakota. So, Holly, thanks so much for being with us today. I'm super excited about this conversation. When we spoke, or when you spoke with our teams a couple of months ago, I think we walked away from the conversation really excited, not only kind of by your excitement about sponsorship and the benefits that it brings North Dakota, but also sort of the innovations and ideas that you're bringing to the work. So my first question is, when we did speak a few months ago, you mentioned that a few communities in North Dakota, like Bismarck, are really embracing the opportunity to involve more community members in acts of welcome, which includes acts of sponsorship. And some of this excitement has been motivated by the ability of sponsorship to attract newcomers and attract their talent to rural communities that may need them for their long-term economic growth. Can you share a little bit more about your sponsor mobilization efforts, including about how that's been anchored by some of the employers in your state?
Sure, Kit. I would be happy to. Thank you for the introduction. So there's been an acknowledgement by many in our state that we have a real need to welcome newcomers, both from an economic and from a humanitarian standpoint. In North Dakota right now, we have about 40,000 open jobs and less than 10,000 people that are actively looking for work. So there's a really high interest in how we attract and retain newcomers. This workforce shortage has really created an opportunity for us to expand knowledge about those who are in need of protection and also the skills and the talents that they bring to our state. In the last couple of years, private sponsorship has really changed the resettlement landscape in North Dakota. If we were to go back 2 years ago, the vast majority of refugee eligible populations were resettling in Fargo, North Dakota, and they were receiving services through a resettlement agency. Today, only about 50% of refugee eligible arrivals are going to Fargo, North Dakota, and the rest are arriving at locations throughout the state. There's really three primary locations, but we really have about 8 different communities where refugees are arriving. And if you look at our refugee eligible population as a whole, you will see that half of them are arriving through private sponsorship programs. So who are the sponsors? Who are sponsoring individuals? And there's really 3 primary groups. The first are our friends and family, right, of eligible overseas individuals. The second group we're seeing are our service clubs and faith-based groups. They definitely have the financial means, and they also have the desire to provide a lot of those on-the-ground support. And the third group is maybe a little bit more surprising to some. We've seen some employer efforts. So there has been between 5 and 10 employers in the state of North Dakota who have worked to recruit Office of Refugee Resettlement eligible individuals overseas based on their skill. And then they've locally coordinated all the details of their sponsorship. So that includes the first few months of housing, their transportation, providing the local community orientation. And those targeted employer efforts have brought about 100 newcomers to the state of North Dakota, just really in the last 6 months. Some of the biggest challenges for those who are coming via that skill-based sponsorship, so they're already going to have that immediate employment met, they're already going to have their immediate housing needs met, but they still need support to establish connections to community life, ongoing English language learning support. It's really important when it comes to building that integration and sense of belonging. And then also opportunities for job upgrades, reskilling, upskilling. We really want to see people continue to grow in their careers and not just fall in one spot without a lot of connection for opportunities to grow.
That's great. I think it's so interesting to see that employers are saying we need, workers in our community, or, communities are saying we want residents, and then have the humanitarian sort of addition to it, versus vice versa. It's always interesting to see how the economic imperative comes in with the humanitarian sort of desire. So you mentioned this, but in sponsorship programs, unlike traditional resettlement, refugees can be welcomed to any part of the state. And so, as you mentioned, it's a huge opportunity for rural communities that are looking to attract new residents or new talent, but there's also some challenges, right? There's also some ways in which you and your office have looked to support these cities and towns and groups that are looking to welcome these newcomers. Can you talk a little bit about how you've addressed some of those challenges or how you're planning to?
Sure, I would be happy to. So building public support and involving the local community in resettlement and integration is really key. Getting people here is really just the first step, but we don't want them to leave, right? We want to ensure that they develop a sense of belonging, that they love living in North Dakota. and that they're able to utilize their skills in a really meaningful way. So as I mentioned, half of our arrivals are not going to our long-standing resettlement site, right? They're going to other locations in the state. So we've asked ourselves, what are the entities that have a statewide presence, that have the expertise and the access point that newcomers really need? And we've partnered with adult learning centers across the state. They have 8 unique locations, and those locations overlap very well with where refugees are going. We've also partnered with North Dakota Job Service. So the adult learning centers are acting very much like a service hub. Newcomers go there for English language learning classes. While they're there, they can meet with refugee career navigators who also provide on-site services at the adult learning centers. So there will be workforce readiness workshops. They can do one-on-one meetings with related to skill assessments, really heavy focus on trying to leverage WIOA funded programming and getting people enrolled in education and training programs. In fact, we've even updated or are updating our WIOA state plan to include a focus on enrolling higher numbers of refugee eligible newcomers into WIOA programming. And then we've also hired local case managers across the state who then provide those in-person services at the adult learning center. So transportation, as you could imagine, in North Dakota, public transportation in many communities in North Dakota is very limited. So as much as we can bring services to a single location to make them highly accessible, that's what we're very focused on doing. Another thing that I'd like to mention is city level collaborations. So we sat down with city government in the 3 cities that are seeing the highest number of refugee arrivals to talk about how do we create a welcoming culture for the benefit of everyone in the city? Because the economic vibrancy of our communities in the long term, to a degree, is dependent on our ability to welcome and include newcomers. And what we ended up landing on through those conversations is that we would work collaboratively to hire community integration facilitators that would be placed at the city level. And I'll just share with you kind of the 3 top priorities of that position. And the first priority of that position is to promote a better understanding of refugee populations on the part of the local community. The second piece of it is to ensure that sponsors have a very visible access point for connection to longer term services for those they're sponsoring. And the third component is kind of related to the first one, but it's to build partnerships across the city that are going to expand access for newcomers to the events, to the programs, to the activities, to all of the things that make each community a really great place to live, because we want people to establish that sense of belonging. We want them to be actively involved and valued. When sponsors are agreeing to become a sponsor, they're accepting a great deal of responsibility to navigate the resettlement ecosystem in ways that have typically been managed by a resettlement agency. And we've noticed that that's a challenge for a lot of sponsors. So in anticipation of Welcome Corps, we're creating kind of a cadence of activities for sponsors by community so that they know what they need to do, by when it needs to be done, and where they need to go locally in order to accomplish that. So kind of demystifying a bit some of the expectations around sponsorship. The last thing I would like to mention is related to English language learning. So the vast majority of our arrivals are going to be in a community, probably 95% are going to be in a community where they're going to have access to in-person English language learning classes through an adult learning center. But there certainly are individuals who don't have that as a possibility. And so we partnered with a company called Engine, that's a virtual English language learning platform. And they focus on building language skills for the workforce. So we hired kind of a statewide Engine lead who's based at an adult learning center. And she coordinates the onboarding and the enrollment of rural arrivals into Engine classes. And we do both kind of self-paced, self-interest type courses, but there also are 30-minute virtual live group classes that folks can enroll in, and we really encourage that. So we have that one statewide lead that kind of keeps an eye on, monitors the progress, and checks in on those who are participating in the from a rural place in the virtual classes. We're also working to build out a virtual case management plan. That is not an easy thing to do, but it's something we're working on. But our focus has really been on establishing as many unique local partnerships as possible. And another partner I didn't mention, but Chambers of Commerce have been a really good partner for us as well, because they work very closely with businesses but they also understand, the importance to support that long-term integration piece to help youth get involved, to help the community be aware, to really help people, become valued members of our community so that they stay in the long term. So they've been a really good bridge for integration efforts. So I guess I think I would say in closing that we know refugees are in need of protection and opportunity. And in North Dakota, we have safe communities that are filled with opportunity. And we're doing whatever it is we can to connect those dots so that we can welcome newcomers. So a lot of these things I mentioned, they're new. They're things that have just either just have launched or are launching. I wish I could tell you, the success of these efforts, but it's really something that we're trying new things, we're building new partnerships, and we're just excited to see where the future leads us.
I love that, Holly. I think what I hear from you is you're embracing the opportunity, you're building out and expanding capacity of existing partners, and you're applying innovation where you need to, where there are still gaps. So I'm going to switch it over to Ben Cabanaw, who many of you know is the State Refugee Coordinator in Michigan, as well as the Deputy Director at the Office of Global Michigan. The Office of Global Michigan, and please correct me if I'm wrong a little bit later, Ben, but oversees sort of all immigrant integration within the state, to include those coming through refugee resettlement, include those coming through all the sponsorship pathways, or those that come through other paths into the United States. And so I know that's what you're really excited about, is to pull all of those streams of work together underneath the umbrella of the Office of Global Michigan. So I'm going to ask sort of a similar question for you, and hopefully you can build upon some of the good words that Holly shared. Michigan's always been a lead in integrating newcomers, particularly because of the economic imperative. Sometimes I think about Michigan being a decade in front of many states about grappling about the ways in which we integrate newcomers in order to maintain or to build our economic vibrancy. Governor Whitmer and other elected officials have come out and said that they see the potential of sponsorship to help kind of solve some of those ongoing economic and workforce challenges. And so how have you as a state been thinking about mobilizing and equipping Michiganders to increase the number of newcomers that call the state home?
Yeah, thanks, Kit. And yes, you're correct as far as kind of like Global Michigan leading the sort of immigrant integration work a little bit more broadly, as well as some of the equity and inclusion work for the state that we feel like is really incorporated into immigrant integration. And our office, Global Michigan, is housed within the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity within the state. And as soon as the various sponsorship opportunities were announced, our department leadership, as well as the Executive Office of the Governor, really wanted to take a lead role. And we explored various ways the state could sort of take ownership of sponsorship programming models and processes, and just kind of think about how we could, lean into it as a state. So the first decision, was to create a dedicated position to support some of our already existing community engagement work. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. But, I was excited and I guess glad to see, that a lot of states, 82%, I think it said, are doing that or exploring that. I think it's been a game changer for us in, kind of approaching how we roll things out. We're just, similar to some of the things Holly shared, we're very intentional right now about building all of our responses or programs or processes from the community level up. And we recognize that employers, educational institutions, local government, including, chambers of commerce, they all have a role, and if engaged rightly, can have a really big impact on our welcoming work. A few very specific examples of how we're doing that is working with our state's Economic Development Corporation on attraction strategies. We're working very closely with universities around immigrant international student retention and employer connections, and hoping that sort of does lean into, some of the campus work for Welcome Corps as well. We are in the process of developing training and technical assistance for employers themselves who are interested in hiring immigrants, including a contracted immigration attorney to provide support, especially to small businesses, rather than, some of our tech hubs or larger corporations that have a lot of that more in-house in their HR programs or offices. And then we also, set up some on-site digital learning and English language learning with employer partners. Pfizer was the sort of biggest example of that early on, and has really sort of ran with that internationally as far as really trying to provide some digital learning and English language learning opportunities on site within their plants. Also just thinking, I think about sort of holistic, I kind of hate this phrase, but wraparound supports to make people successful. So we've really developed a very close partnership with our state housing authority and just launched a newcomer rental subsidy program, which I've shared with a lot of folks about that. We have a global talent and retention program that we've got state funding for to really develop those relationships with employers, all those partners I was talking about, but really like trying to develop people's skills and placing them into, appropriate jobs, and have advocated hard, recognizing both the need for sponsorship, especially those populations that are not or are eligible, have advocated really hard for state funding. I've gotten over the last 2 years over $20 million in state funding to invest largely in legal services, talent retention support, and housing. And then just in addition to our immigrant serving organizations, we've really tried to involve previous co-sponsors, current sponsors, and various community groups to sort of do outreach and support potential sponsors in the outreach process and promotion of the support programs.
That's amazing. And I think what I hear from both you and Holly is sort of, again, taking advantage of the opportunity that sponsorship provides, embedding it in your existing sort of programs, and then building out a system that provides a better welcoming infrastructure for all, whether you come through Refugee Resettlement Agency, whether you come from sponsored newcomers, and maybe eventually for asylees or other folks that call your state home. I think at this moment, I know that we're a little bit over time, so I want to switch over to the Q&A section of our presentation.